So maybe you've asked recently, Tom, Mr. Legman, Titanium himself, what's up with all these units in Triangle Strategy? They have classes, but none of them are the same class. They don't even overlap with enemy classes, really, and they all have different abilities. How am I supposed to decide how to use someone when I don't even know what their capital J job is? Well, rest easy, young tactician. Just like I helped you figure out how to manage yourself on and off the battlefield in our two previous guides, there's a system you can use to answer that very question, no matter the character in question, right here in this guide that I've made for you. Introducing the Roles Analysis System, a system of my own design, which uses 3 categories to describe your army. These categories are as follows: Disruptors, Sweepers, and Supporters. For those of you who are used to the classic RPG tropes, and I imagine that's many of you, given the type of game Triangle Strategy is, you might be surprised that I'm not using the classics of Fighter, Mage, Thief, or Tank, Wizard, Rogue. But there's a reason for that. In Triangle Strategy, the roles of your characters are not quite so strictly defined. You have mages that care more about disrupting the enemy than they do dealing damage, and healers who wish to deal damage in the midst of the enemy ranks as much as they wish to heal. Sometimes you even have dudes wielding greatswords who spend more time buffing their allies than they do smacking the enemy. These characters and their roles go far beyond the RPG classics. So what do these roles mean? Let's discuss. Note, I won't be going over every character in the game and what their roles are. Instead, I'll be explaining the roles themselves while giving specific examples so you can decide for yourself who should be doing what based on how you run your army. First up, let's talk about Disruptors. Disruptors fulfill a similar role to your classic tanks, aiming to keep the enemy away from your sweepers and supporters. They can do this by throwing themselves into the enemy ranks, twisting the terrain to your advantage, or outright incapacitating both individual and groups of soldiers. Essentially, any character that slows a target down, debuffs them, or forces them to change who they're targeting counts as a disruptor. Let's look at 2 examples, Eredor and Huet. Eredor, he's traditional. A heavily armored, tanky unit who bends the battlefield around him. His core skills are Provoke and Ram Foe. He specializes in making the enemy attack him and shoving enemies away from the more delicate characters when he can't. He's a big man in big armor with a big personality. Everything you might expect. You can also expect him to stand in the open, take hits, dish them out, and generally be a menace for the enemy. But that's just one approach to the art of disruption. Let's look at another. Huet, as you might guess, is also a disruptor, but of a very different ilk than Eredor. It's obvious at a glance that she's not meant to be tanking, and you may even want her to be dealing damage. And you'd be right. Huet is our first example of a hybrid role character, having elements of both disruptor and sweeper, with an emphasis on disruptor. Her signature abilities are Blinding Arrow and Shadow Stitching Arrow, allowing her to significantly reduce the enemy's chance to hit and prevent them from approaching you in the first place. However, her attacks also deal very respectable damage, and her mobility and range as a hawk-mounted archer make it very easy for her to attain critical backstabs and trigger follow-up attacks. As such, whenever you aren't trying to disrupt the enemy, or even when you are, Huet's sweeper abilities can also shine. But what does the role of sweeper entail? Are they only damage dealers? How much damage are we talking? Let's find out. The first example of a sweeper that everyone should know is the good Prince of Glenbrook himself, Roland. All Roland cares about is damage. He wants to move in from range to activate his opportune attack, then follow up with a big rush or double thrust for maximum damage dealing. His mount allows him to flank the enemy for critical backstabs and follow-ups, as well as making it easier for him to escape if he starts to get overwhelmed. Even his more disruptor-adjacent skill, Pushback, is best used for dealing damage by knocking enemies into one another and dropping them off cliffs. It's really all there is to him at the end of the day. He just hits hard. Doesn't take hits very well in response, though. In comparison, let's look at Yulio. Yulio is an early recruit with a bookish look about him, but who wields a curved greatsword. These 2 facts alone should tell you that he is another dual-role character, both a sweeper and a supporter, and one who plays around with TP at that. Yulio does two things very, very well: dealing big damage and empowering your allies. His base skills, Moment of Truth and Not on My Watch, embody this. Moment of Truth allows Yulio to grant an extra TP to an ally while also buffing their damage, while Not on My Watch deals damage to an enemy and drains them of TP. Later, Yulio even gets a melee range magic attack that does very good single target damage as well, making him quite versatile on the battlefield. I want to take a look at one more example of a sweeper in Corentin, a Frost Mage that players may receive depending on the route choice you make at Chapter 3. Corentin is a dual-role sweeper and disruptor, adept at dealing single target and AoE damage, but who also ices up the ground to slow down enemies. He can even put up walls of ice to directly block the enemy, and some of his spells, such as Frosty Fetters, can inflict status effects as well. In the case of Frosty Fetters, not only does it deal very good single target damage to a single enemy, but it also reduces their speed for 3 turns and freezes the square upon which the target is standing, meaning it will take fewer turns, and when they do get to take a turn, it will be harder for them to move forward as well. He's an incredibly versatile unit, and a great addition to your army, but I bring him up here to show that sweepers on their own are quite narrow. If they aren't a dual role unit, they don't really do anything but deal damage. Some are better at single target, and some are better spent dealing with groups, but it's all about the damage with these characters, as opposed to disruptors, who have a variety of ways that they can disrupt the enemy, and supporters, who can support in a myriad of ways. Speaking of which, let's take a look at supporters, shall we? Unlike sweepers, supporters are quite versatile. They're healers, they apply buffs, they grant extra turns, and generally they make sure that your army keeps on ticking and are able to do what you need them to do. Of course, nobody is a better example of a pure supporter than Benedict Pascal himself. He doesn't heal, but, if there's a stat, he can buff it. Attack, defense, movement, he can do it all. He can even grant an immediate turn to an ally using Now, or make it so they get 2 turns when they're next up via twofold turn. He's a simple character who enables huge plays, but he does next to nothing to the enemy. Conversely, there's Hasabara, House Wolfort Barkeep and Mounted Healer Extraordinaire. Hasabara is an interesting character as she both wants to heal but also wants to deal damage, landing her squarely in a supporter sweeper dual role. Her Be Brave skill heals allies in an area around her, while her Cleave skill allows her to hit 3 enemies in a horizontal line in front of her. She also shares Roland's Pushback skill, allowing her to set up clash damage and knock enemies off cliffs as well. She's not as effective a healer as someone like Gila, but she can get the job done. And she goes to show it's not just your classic clerics who can make good support units. And that, my fellow tacticians, is the roles analysis system. Most units in Triangle Strategy have multiple roles they can fulfill depending on what upgrades you give them, who you unlock when, and how you prefer to play. So, if you find yourself having trouble deducing what to do with a new character, pay attention to their skills and the type of weapon they have, and don't be afraid to be flexible with the way you use them. Remember, disruptors will be focused on crippling the enemy with skills that debuff and cause status effects, as opposed to your sweepers, whose skills will be focused on just dealing raw damage in as big a number as possible, while your supporters are buffing the two and making sure they stay healed up. Just because someone has a big sword doesn't mean they always want to hit the enemy. If the roles analysis system is something that you find useful, please do leave a like. As we all know, YouTube loves to see that interaction, and you'd be doing me a service. If you see a way to refine this system, let me know in the comments. And if there are other aspects of Triangle Strategy's design that you'd like a guide for, let me know. I'd be happy to make one. Before I go, I want to say thank you, as always, to my members. So thank you to Killer Cake, Shimia Saturn, Coda Gray, Canadian Animator Guy, Chaotic Taco, IR Fine, Light B, and new member, Schnorble. Thank you guys so much. If you want to join as a member and help directly support me and make sure that I can keep making videos like this, you can do so for $5 a month. You'll receive a plethora of benefits, including stickers and specific emotes that you can use in streams, and a shout out on Fridays. So if you want to do that, that would be great. And also, if you've made it this far, the secret code for the video is Avlora is best girl. Thanks again, everyone. Stay safe and healthy out there. And remember, be good to each other. Bye now.